Sunday dinner was never about how much money was in the house. It was about what a woman could do with almost none. A quarter, a mason jar of bacon grease, a hen too old to lay, and somehow the whole family sat down together and called it a feast. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. None of this was survival food. It was architecture. 30 dishes. 30 women who did math nobody taught them, standing over a stove, making a dollar do what a dollar was never supposed to do. Number 30. Sunday pot roast with root vegetables. The roast went in small on purpose. 35 cents of chuck, tough and marbled with gristle, surrounded by carrots split lengthwise, potatoes quartered, onions left whole to go sweet, and collapsed in the drippings. 4 hours in a low oven on a Midwest farmhouse stove, and the meat wasn't the meal anymore. The vegetables were. 6, 7, 8 plates from one 35-cent cut. Grandma just called it Sunday. She was right. Number 29. Chicken and dumplings. She never killed a hen that was still laying. She waited until it stopped. Worth maybe a dime by then, too tough to fry. And she boiled it low and slow in an Appalachian kitchen until the meat surrendered off the bone. Dumplings dropped into the broth like clouds sinking. Today a restaurant charges $22 for this and calls it heritage cooking. Grandma called it Tuesday's hen, finally earning her keep. Number 28. Scrapple. Pennsylvania Dutch kitchens didn't throw away the parts of the hog other people wouldn't look at. Scraps and cornmeal, simmered down and set into a loaf pan overnight, sliced thin and fried crisp at the edges, soft in the middle. Pennies a pound. Nearly nothing of that animal was wasted. Not the organs, not the trim, not the broth it cooked in. That is not thrift. That is discipline modern kitchens forgot on purpose. Number 27. Hoover stew. They named it out of spite. In the relief lines in the Hoovervilles of the early 1930s, hot dogs sliced thin, elbow macaroni, a can of tomatoes, a can of corn, under 30 cents for a pot that fed a whole camp. They blamed a president's name for a stew built from nothing, and somehow the stew still tasted like defiance. Number 26. Poor man's roast. In the immigrant kitchens of the industrial Midwest, a family could not afford duck. So they made one. Flank steak pounded thin, rolled around bread stuffing thick with onion and sage, tied and roasted until it sliced like something grand. This was not flank steak. This was Sunday, performed with total conviction on a beef scrap budget. Number 25. Sawmill gravy and biscuits before sunrise in the logging camps of the rural South. Before the saws started their long scream through the pines, someone was already at a cast-iron skillet. Bacon drippings, a scoop of flour stirred in until it turned the color of wet sand, milk poured slow and whisked until the whole pan went thick and pale, and peppered black across the top. Under 15 cents for a batch that covered a full pan of biscuits, split open and steaming, soaking up the gravy until the plate was gone before the fork stopped moving. This wasn't breakfast so much as fuel, calculated fuel, built for men about to spend 10 hours swinging an axe. Fat for the calories a body actually burns. Flour for the hours between meals. Nothing fancy, nothing garnished, nothing that needed a name beyond what it was. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. White gravy over biscuits has more staying power, pound for pound, than half the energy products stacked on a modern gas station shelf, and it cost, adjusted for inflation, roughly a nickel a serving. Grandma just called it gravy. She didn't call it a superfood, didn't call it a hack, didn't call it anything but Tuesday. That is not a small thing to have known without a textbook. Number 24. Salmon patties. A single can of salmon, 19 cents in a working-class kitchen of the 1940s, whether that kitchen sat in landlocked Nebraska or a mill town in Ohio, went further than anyone today would believe. Bones and all, mashed with a fork until they disappeared. Breadcrumbs, an egg, onion minced fine enough to vanish into the mixture, formed into patties and fried in a skillet until the edges turned the deep amber brown of a good crust. the whole kitchen filling with a smell that was somehow both ocean and Sunday at once. One can, a family of 6. Patties enough for seconds if anyone was still hungry, which, after a plate of these with a side of stewed tomatoes, almost nobody was. Today you'll find salmon cakes on a brunch menu for $19, plated with a smear of something French, and the recipe is not meaningfully different from what came out of a working woman's kitchen for the price of the can alone. That is not culinary innovation. That is the same idea. Wearing a jacket it didn't earn. Grandma just called it salmon patties and served them without apology, because there was nothing to apologize for. Number 23. Fried cabbage and potatoes. In the tenements of Chicago and the boarding houses of the Northeast, German and Irish immigrant women worked with what the pushcart vendors sold cheapest. And cabbage, at 5 cents a head in the 1930s, was cheapest of all. Shredded thin, thrown into a skillet already slicked with bacon fat, potatoes cubed and added alongside until both went soft at the edges and caramelized at the corners, the whole pan turning a deep gold brown that smelled like something far richer than 5 cents. Outsiders called it poverty food. Called it what the Irish ate, what the Germans ate, said it with a curl in their voice like it meant something shameful. The people at the table never heard it that way. To them it was simply Sunday, the pan scraped clean, second helpings passed without asking. This was not poverty food. This was a full pot of something warm, built from a nickel's worth of vegetable and a spoonful of fat, feeding a table of 8 on a factory wage that barely covered rent. There is a difference between a family that has nothing and a family that knows precisely what to do with a little. And it is a difference the people mocking them from outside the kitchen never once understood. Number 22. Ham, hocks, and beans. On tenant farms across the rural South, the hock was the part the butcher practically gave away. Bony, tough, mostly skin and connective tissue, worth maybe 15 or 20 cents in the 1930s. Grandma didn't see waste. She saw 4 hours. Dropped into a pot with dried beans and water, and left to simmer low until the collagen broke down into something silken, the whole kitchen thick with a smell that clung to the curtains for a day afterward. By the time it was ready, the beans had gone creamy and rich, the hock meat falling loose from bone with barely a touch of a fork. 1 pot, 1 20-cent piece of meat, and there was dinner Sunday and dinner again Monday, the flavor somehow deeper the second day. Land-grant nutrition researchers studying rural Southern diets in this era found something the butchers never advertised. The hock, discarded as worthless, was dense with iron, collagen, and minerals that the good cuts simply didn't carry in the same concentration. The poorest piece of the animal was, by the numbers, one of the most nutritionally complete. She was right. Everything she knew was right, long before anyone in a lab coat confirmed it for her. Number 21. Chicken fried steak. Out on the cattle ranges of Texas, where cowhands worked cattle they'd never taste the good parts of, the cube steak was what was left. Tough, sinewy, worth about a dime a pound in the 1930s. So it got pounded, beaten flat with the edge of a plate or the back of a skillet until the fibers gave up their fight, dredged in flour, dropped into hot fat until the crust turned deep bronze and shattered under a fork. Smothered in cream gravy peppered black, served alongside mashed potatoes that soaked up everything the steak couldn't hold, it ate like a steak 20 times its price. Ranch hands finishing a 16-hour day didn't care that the meat underneath the crust was the cheapest cut on the animal. They cared that it was hot, that there was enough of it, and that it tasted like something worth the ache in their shoulders. This was not a cheap cut apologizing for itself. This was a cheap cut refusing to. The flour and the fire did what money couldn't. Turned a dime's worth of tough beef into something that sat on a plate like it belonged to a rancher, not a ranch hand. Number 20. Beef and noodles over mashed potatoes. German-American farm kitchens across the Midwest ran on a trick that sounds almost absurd until you taste it. Carbohydrate on carbohydrate, and somehow it worked. A small handful of stew beef, maybe a third of what a modern recipe would call for, braised down with onion until the broth turned dark and glossy. Egg noodles rolled out by hand on a floured table, cut into wide ribbons, dropped into that broth until they went tender and started drinking up the gravy. And then, instead of a plate, the whole thing went over a mound of mashed potatoes. Meat stretched by noodles, stretched again by potatoes, until a few dollars' worth of beef became dinner for a table of 8 for well under 40 cents. It shouldn't have worked as a meal. Too much starch, not enough restraint, by any modern plating logic. But hunger doesn't care about plating logic, and neither did the women serving it. They understood something simple and completely lost on the modern kitchen. Fullness matters as much as flavor, and a family fed on beef and noodles over potatoes went to bed satisfied in a way no amount of clever garnish has ever managed to replicate. Number 19. Ham and beans with cornbread. The Sunday after a holiday ham in kitchens across Appalachia and the rural South, nothing about that ham was ever considered finished. The bone went into a pot with a fresh batch of dried beans and simmered for hours, pulling out every last thread of meat still clinging to it, every bit of marrow, every bit of salt the curing process had left behind, essentially free. A meal built entirely from what most modern kitchens throw in the trash without a second thought. Skillet cornbread baked alongside it, crisp-edged from bacon grease in a cast-iron pan, heated until it smoked, crumbled into the bean liquor the way it had been crumbled into bowls for generations before anyone in that kitchen was born. Church potlucks in the 1930s and 40s ran on this dish specifically because it cost almost nothing to bring and fed almost everyone. A family could show up with a pot of ham and beans and know, without question, that it would be gone by the end of the afternoon, not out of politeness, but because it was genuinely one of the best things on the table, sitting quietly next to dishes that cost 10 times as much to make. Number 18. Creamed chipped beef on toast. Soldiers called it something unprintable. Families called it Sunday supper. A jar of dried salted beef, sliced paper thin, about 15 cents in the 1940s, torn into a white cream sauce built from butter, flour, and milk, poured hot and thick over toast until the bread went soft underneath and held its shape on top. It was a dish born of necessity that outlived the necessity itself. Long after the war, long after ration books stopped mattering, families kept making it, not because they had to, but because the salt and cream combination had wormed its way into what Sunday was supposed to taste like. 1 jar of dried beef, a pot of white sauce, a loaf of bread, and a family of 5 was fed for under a quarter, with the smell of butter and black pepper filling a kitchen that, an hour earlier, held almost nothing that looked like a meal. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. This exact combination, cured protein suspended in a butter and flour sauce, is the base of half the elevated comfort food served in white tablecloth restaurants today, minus the tablecloth, minus the 15-cent jar, minus any memory of where it actually came from. Number 17. Liver and onions. Butchers in the 1930s and 40s often handed liver over for nothing, or close to it. A few cents at most, sometimes tossed in free with a larger purchase because so few customers wanted it. Grandma wanted it. Sliced thin, dredged lightly in flour, seared hot and fast in a skillet until the outside browned and the inside stayed just barely pink, piled high with onions cooked down slow until they'd gone sweet and nearly black at the edges. The smell filled a house in a way few other dishes could. Sharp, mineral, unmistakable, and it was not a smell everyone loved. But the plate emptied anyway, because a family that had learned to be grateful for free protein didn't have room for pickiness. What nobody in that kitchen needed a nutritionist to explain was that liver carried more usable iron, more B vitamins, more raw density of nutrition than nearly anything else on the table, purchased or otherwise. They knew things about organ meat that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember, mostly because supermarket shelves quietly stopped stocking it, and an entire generation grew up never once smelling onions cooked down that dark. Number 16. Smothered pork chops, the cheapest chops in the case, thin, bone-in, sometimes with more fat than meat, went for a few cents apiece in southern markets of the 1930s. Seared hard in a cast-iron skillet until the outside caught color, then buried under a gravy built from the very fond left behind in the pan, onions cooked down soft, milk or broth poured in and simmered until the chops had gone tender enough to cut with the side of a fork. The gravy did the work the chop alone couldn't. Thin meat, smothered low and slow, came out the other side rich and falling apart, served over rice or alongside biscuits that existed for the sole purpose of mopping up whatever gravy was left in the pan. This was a dish that understood something about cheap cuts modern cooking has largely forgotten. Time is a seasoning, too. A thin, unremarkable chop, given 90 minutes under a lid instead of 5 minutes on high heat, becomes an entirely different piece of meat. Grandma didn't need a culinary term for braising. She needed a lid, a low flame, and the patience of a woman who had somewhere to be in an hour and knew the stove would handle it without her standing over it. Number 15. Swiss steak, round steak tough as shoe leather straight off the cutting board, cost about 12 cents a pound in Midwest and Plains farm towns of the 1930s, and it stayed that cheap for a reason. Nobody wanted to fight it with a fork. So Grandma didn't fight it. She pounded flour directly into the meat with the edge of a heavy plate, tenderizing and thickening in the same motion, seared it hard in a hot skillet, then buried it in tomatoes and onion and let it braise for 2 hours until the fibers gave up entirely. What came out was unrecognizable from what went in. Fork tender, the sauce thick and rust red, ladled over the meat and whatever starch was on hand that week. A pound of the cheapest steak in the case, feeding a family of 6 with leftovers besides. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Land-grant universities running nutrition surveys through the Depression and into the 1940s found that dishes built around tough, collagen-rich cuts, hocks, chuck, round steak, the cuts nobody wanted, consistently delivered more usable protein and more essential minerals per penny than the tender, expensive cuts prized in wealthier kitchens. The science quietly sided with poverty. It didn't matter. By the 1950s, supermarket meat cases had been rearranged around convenience and tenderness, and the cuts that had fed the country through its hardest decade started disappearing from the center of the case, pushed to the back, priced as though they were the lesser choice instead of the smarter one. That is not progress. That is a body of knowledge, hard won over a decade of real hunger, discarded the moment it stopped being necessary. Number 14. American goulash. Hungarian and German immigrant kitchens across the industrial Midwest built this from whatever the icebox offered that week. Elbow macaroni, a small portion of ground beef, a can of tomatoes, an onion, seasoned with whatever paprika or pepper was on the shelf. Under 25 cents for the whole pot, and it stretched across a family the way almost nothing else could, thick and red and steaming, ladled into bowls that got scraped clean. Some called it slumgullion out west, said with a laugh more than an insult, the name itself sounding like exactly what it was. Everything, together, in one pot, because there wasn't the luxury of cooking things separately. It didn't need a fancy name to earn its place at the table. It needed to be hot, and there needed to be enough of it, and on both counts it delivered without fail. There's a reason this dish survived quietly in family recipe boxes for 100 years, while fancier things from the same era disappeared. It wasn't sentiment. It was that a pound of ground beef, handled with the right instincts, could still feed 8 people on a Tuesday when the paycheck hadn't come yet, and every family that ever needed that trick to work kept the recipe close, generation after generation, without ever writing down why. Number 13. Pierogi with butter and onions. In the Polish neighborhoods of Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland through the 1920s and 30s, Sunday meant flour on every surface of the kitchen. Dough rolled thin, cut into rounds, filled with mashed potato, and a little cheese if there was any to spare, pinched shut by hand, dozens of them. An entire afternoon of labor that cost, in raw ingredients, pennies a batch, boiled until they floated, then finished in a skillet of butter and onions cooked down until they'd gone soft and gold. This was not a quick meal. It was a slow one, built by hands that had made the same fold 1,000 times before, filling a kitchen with the smell of butter going brown while children were sent outside, so there'd be room to work the dough. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. The frozen pierogi in the supermarket freezer aisle today, $4 for a box of 12, machine-formed and gas flash frozen, is trying to imitate something that took a Polish grandmother an entire Sunday afternoon to build by hand. And every single person who has tasted both knows, without needing to be told, which one actually deserves the name number 12. Cabbage rolls. Eastern European immigrant families across the industrial Midwest built this dish around a simple piece of arithmetic. A small amount of meat, wrapped in something free, cabbage leaves, softened in boiling water until pliable, filled with rice, and a modest portion of ground beef or pork, rolled tight and packed into a pot with tomato sauce, simmered for hours until the cabbage went silky, and the filling had absorbed every bit of the sauce around it. A single pound of meat, divided among a dozen or more rolls, fed a family that in a wealthier kitchen would have needed 3 or 4 times as much protein to feel satisfied. The trick wasn't deprivation. It was distribution. Spreading a small luxury thin enough that everyone got a taste of it, wrapped in something that cost almost nothing and absorbed all the flavor around it in the process. Grandma just called it gołąbki, the way her mother had, the way generations before had, and never once apologized for how little meat was actually inside each roll, because the dish was never about the meat. It was about a family sitting down together on a Sunday, and every roll on that plate representing a piece of a country most of them would never see again. Number 11. Beef tongue with gravy. On farms that raised their own beef, nothing went to the neighbor or the trash. And the tongue, considered by most a throwaway cut worth about 8 cents a pound in the 1930s, went into a pot of simmering water for hours until the outer skin peeled away clean. What was left underneath was startlingly tender, almost buttery, sliced thin and finished in a rich pan gravy built from the cooking liquid itself. Most families outside the farm wouldn't touch it. Something about the shape, the origin, made people squeamish in a way that had nothing to do with taste and everything to do with unfamiliarity. The families who did eat it knew better. Sliced and gravied, it disappeared from the platter as fast as any roast, and nobody at that table thought twice about where it came from, because hunger has never once cared about squeamishness. This was not a strange meal. This was an entire vocabulary of the animal that modern eating has simply forgotten. Tongue, cheek, heart, hock. Each one distinct, each one worth knowing. Each one now unrecognizable to a generation raised entirely on boneless, skinless, and pre-trimmed. Number 10. Fried bologna and gravy. A ring of bologna, 10 cents in Appalachian and rural southern general stores of the 1940s and 50s, sliced thick and scored across the top so it wouldn't curl up like a bowl in the skillet. Fried hard until the edges went dark and crisp, then smothered, the same way the pork chops were smothered, the same way half of Sunday dinner across this whole list was smothered, in a gravy built from the drippings left behind. It was, by any wealthy kitchen standard, an absurd dish. Processed lunch meat, treated with the same reverence as a Sunday roast. But reverence isn't about the ingredient. It's about the attention paid to it, and Grandma paid the same attention to a 10-cent ring of bologna that a French chef pays to a cut of beef costing $40 a pound. This was not bologna pretending to be something else. This was a family deciding, together and without discussion, that a 10-cent piece of meat deserved a gravy, a biscuit, and a seat at the Sunday table. And that decision, made in kitchen after kitchen across an entire region, was its own quiet form of dignity. Number 9. Souse. After a hog was butchered, the head went into a pot along with vinegar, onion, and whatever spices were on hand, simmered for hours until the meat fell away from bone entirely. Packed into a loaf pan with the gelatin-rich cooking liquid, cooled until it set into something firm enough to slice. Cold, tangy, dense, with the kind of flavor that comes only from parts modern butchers no longer sell at all. Pennsylvania, Dutch, and rural Southern kitchens made this as a matter of course, not out of desperation, but out of a completely different understanding of what an animal was for. Nothing about the hog was waste. Everything had a use, a name, a place on the table, and souse was simply the final answer to a question most modern eaters never think to ask. What happens to the rest of it? Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Souse and its European cousins, head cheese, brawn, terrine de tête, sit at the exact origin point of what fine dining now calls charcuterie, sold in small artisanal portions for prices that would have stunned the woman who made it from parts nobody else would touch. Number 8. Turkey necks and rice. After a holiday turkey was carved down to nothing, the neck, bony, mostly cartilage, worth pennies at the butcher counter even when purchased on its own, went into a pot with water and simmered for hours in kitchens across the rural South. What emerged was a broth so deeply flavored it barely needed seasoning, the meat falling loose from bone in dark, tender threads stirred through rice that had soaked up every bit of that broth as it cooked. This was the Sunday after the holiday, the dish that came together while the family was still tired from the feast 3 days before, built entirely from the part of the bird that most modern kitchens throw directly into the garbage without a second thought. A pound or two of turkey necks, a pot of rice, and a family was fed for the price of almost nothing. The actual cost of the meal was the 2 hours it took to coax flavor out of bones, and nobody in that era considered 2 hours of a woman's time to be a cost worth counting. It was simply what Sunday required, and she gave it without complaint. Number 7. Chow chow and pinto beans with cornbread. At the end of Appalachian garden season, whatever hadn't ripened in time, green tomatoes, cabbage ends, peppers too small to sell, went into jars with vinegar and sugar and spice, put up as chow chow, a relish sharp enough to cut through anything. Come Sunday, a spoonful sat next to a bowl of pinto beans that had simmered all afternoon, pennies a pound, and a wedge of skillet cornbread baked crisp in bacon grease. Nothing on that plate had cost more than a few cents. The beans were dried and cheap. The cornbread was cornmeal and a little fat. The chow chow was garden scraps that would otherwise have rotted on the vine, transformed into something bright and vinegared that woke up every other bite on the plate. This was not a meal assembled from leftovers out of desperation. This was preservation as an art form. A woman looking at a garden's dying end in September and seeing not waste, but next February's dinner, jarred and waiting on a cellar shelf, ready the moment a pot of beans needed something sharp to cut through all that starch. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. An entire vocabulary of the animal. Tongue, neck, head, hock, liver, heart, vanished from the American plate within 2 generations, and it did not disappear because people stopped liking the taste. Supermarket meat departments, redesigned through the 1950s and 60s around speed and squeamishness, quietly stopped stocking these cuts, pushing shoppers toward boneless, trimmed, prepackaged center cuts that photographed better and required no skill to prepare. Families didn't reject organ meat and odd cuts. They simply stopped being offered them, generation after generation, until a grandchild raised entirely on chicken breast had no idea her great-grandmother ever ate anything else, and no idea what she'd lost by never having the chance to. That is not consumer preference. That is a vocabulary erased by a shelf redesign nobody voted on. Number 6. Cornmeal mush with milk and molasses, when the meat ran out entirely, and in rural Appalachian and Plains kitchens of the 1930s, it ran out more often than anyone likes to admit. Sunday supper became cornmeal mush. Cornmeal at 3 cents a pound, stirred slowly into boiling water until it thickened into something between porridge and paste. Poured into a bowl and topped with cold milk and a dark ribbon of molasses that sank slowly through the mush as it was eaten. There was no meat on this plate. No vegetable, even. Just corn, milk, and sweetness, and somehow, told through the right voice at the right table, it was still Sunday. Still the day the family sat down together instead of eating standing up between chores. Still a meal with a beginning and an end instead of something grabbed and gone. A family that could make 3 cents of cornmeal feel like an occasion had learned something most modern households, surrounded by abundance, have never had to learn at all. That a meal's dignity was never really about what was on the plate. It was about who was sitting around it, and whether anyone was made to feel like they were owed an apology for what they were being served. Nobody at that table ever was. Number 5. Poor man's duck. Not to be confused with the stuffed flank steak further up this list. This was something else entirely. In the immigrant kitchens of the urban Midwest, a mixture of ground meat scraps, breadcrumbs, an egg was formed by hand into the unmistakable shape of a whole roasted bird, browned in the oven until the outside crisped and darkened exactly the way a real duck's skin would. It was, in the most literal sense, an act of theater. A family that could not afford duck, could not afford the occasion duck represented, built the shape of that occasion out of what they had, and set it on the table with the same ceremony a wealthier family would give the real thing, carved with the same flourish, served with the same pride. This was not duck. This was a family refusing to let a Sunday feel smaller than it deserved to feel, using nothing but ground scraps and the shape of a memory to make it happen. There is something almost defiant in that, a refusal, plate by plate, to let poverty dictate what a family's most important meal of the week was allowed to look like. Number 4. Beans and fatback with skillet cornbread in sharecropper cabins across the Mississippi Delta in the 1930s. This was the meal that appeared most Sundays, whether there was anything else in the house or not. Dried beans simmered for hours with a small piece of fatback. Pure pork fat, salt-cured, sliced thin, and rendered slowly into the pot until every bean carried a trace of it. Under 10 cents for the entire dish. Skillet cornbread baked alongside, crisp-bottomed from a pan heated until it smoked before the batter ever touched it. There was nothing complicated here. No spice beyond salt and whatever pepper was on the shelf. Just beans, fat, and cornmeal, cooked with the kind of attention that turned 3 ingredients into something a family looked forward to all week, not something they merely tolerated because there was nothing else. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. A bowl of beans and fatback, by the numbers land-grant researchers gathered in this era, delivered more usable protein and fat-soluble nutrition per penny than nearly any dish on any table in the country, wealthy or poor. 10 cents of food, and it was, nutritionally, one of the smartest meals in America. Number 3. Rabbit and gravy. Out on the Great Plains and across rural Texas ranch land, a rabbit trapped or shot on a Saturday afternoon was free, No cost at all beyond a boy's time and a bit of ammunition. Cleaned, cut into pieces, dredged and fried the same way chicken would have been, then smothered in a peppered gravy and served over biscuits split open to catch every drop. Cowboys on long cattle drives ate this over open fire when the herd was moving too far from town to buy anything. Farm families ate it on Sundays when cash was too tight to buy a chicken outright. Either way, it tasted, by every account passed down, indistinguishable from chicken to anyone who hadn't been told otherwise. Tender, mild, perfectly at home under a blanket of cream gravy. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. In 1956, a major food manufacturer launched an advertising campaign explicitly built around convincing American housewives that time spent cooking from scratch was time stolen from their families, reframing an entire skill set developed over generations and passed hand to hand from mother to daughter as a burden to be escaped rather than a craft to be proud of. The campaign worked. Within a decade, boxed and instant foods had displaced dishes like these on tables across the country, not because they tasted better and not because families had more money, but because an entire generation had been told, deliberately and repeatedly, that the alternative was something to be ashamed of. That is not convenience. That is a theft dressed up in a magazine ad, and it worked exactly as intended. Number 2. Chicken and rice. In the Mexican-American communities of Texas and the Southwest, a single chicken, bought whole, nothing wasted, in the 1930s and 40s, became an entire Sunday. Simmered first for broth, the meat pulled and set aside, the broth then used to cook rice until every grain had gone golden and fragrant. The chicken returned to the pot at the end, so nothing dried out, nothing went to waste. Nothing was cooked twice when once would do. One bird, properly handled, fed a table of 8 or more with room for the broth alone to become tomorrow's lunch. The rice carried flavor a plain side never could, because it had never been plain. It had been built, slowly, out of everything the chicken had to give before the chicken itself ever touched a plate. This was not a simple dish. This was efficiency raised to the level of instinct, a woman using every part of one animal across 2 meals without a recipe card, without a measuring cup, guided entirely by decades of watching her own mother do the same thing in the same kitchen, on the same kind of Sunday, for a family that never once went without. Number 1. Sunday meatloaf with oatmeal filler, 20 cents of ground beef, in the urban industrial towns of the 1930s and 40s should not have fed a family of 6. It did, because Grandma doubled it, a cup of oatmeal, uncooked, folded straight into the meat, along with breadcrumbs and a single egg, absorbing the fat and the moisture as it baked, until the loaf came out the oven twice the size it went in, dense, sliceable, holding together on the plate the way a much larger, much more expensive loaf never could have without the same trick. Ketchup or a simple tomato glaze brushed across the top, caramelized dark in the last 20 minutes of baking. Sliced thick, served with mashed potatoes that mopped up whatever juices ran across the plate, this was the dish that came to define what Sunday dinner even meant for an entire generation of American families, who never had the money to call it anything grander. Today it's sold reheated, frozen, in a plastic tray for $9, smaller, denser, without the oatmeal, without the hands that shaped it, without a single person who understood why the trick worked in the first place. That is not meatloaf. That is the memory of meatloaf, sold back to us at 9 times the price and none of the skill. Closing 30 dishes. 30 women who never called themselves geniuses, who never wrote a cookbook, who never once thought what they were doing deserved a name beyond Sunday. They stretched a hen, doubled a meatloaf, turned a hog's head into something worth slicing thin. They fed families of 8 on money that wouldn't buy a sandwich today, and they did it every single week, without complaint, without a recipe card, guided by nothing but memory and necessity, and a refusal to let their families feel poor at their own table. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. It wasn't an accident that this knowledge disappeared. It was engineered, sold out of us one magazine ad, one supermarket redesign, one convenience campaign at a time, until a grandmother's instincts were replaced by a barcode. She was right. Everything she knew was right, and it took 2 generations and a mountain of processed food for anyone to start admitting it. That is not progress. That is a theft with a good marketing budget. Try one this week. Just one. Pick a hen, a hawk, a can of salmon, and see what your own kitchen can still remember how to do. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother made.